quick overview of what we did this past summer in the Lassen area, looking at the remaining populations of Cascade frogs. And I've given a talk here before talking about the status of Cascades frogs, where we brought up Lassen area. And basically, the situation is pretty grim in Lassen, and so we worked with the Lassen National Forest and said we should really find out what is going on with the remaining populations. Because in the past, we've just done single surveys, go and say, wow, there's not many frogs here. But what's happening with these remaining populations? So the objectives of this past summer were to determine remaining population size and viability of Cascade, and that, of course, will take another year to really get at, to build some models. Summarize habitat attributes at locations with frogs, and assess potential reasons for poor recruitment, and then come up with some management recommendations for both short-term and long-term. So in California, just to remind you, there's two areas with Cascades frogs, basically the Klamath Mountains and then the southern Cascades. And this is the southern extent of its range. And the area we're going to be focusing in on is this Lassen area. In 2007, we went to a bunch of sites that had past sightings of frogs, either historical or more recent, and focused in on good habitats, and basically came up with the black dots are where John and Justin found frogs, and then the open dots are where they did not. And so this past year we did an even more site-specific effort, focused in on the remaining populations. This Cutter Meadows here and Cow Creek are both on private property, of course, timberlands, and given that our funding was from the forest and they want to focus in on the forest, we did sample at one of the private sites, but not the other. So Cutter, we have not done any repeated sampling. So Monty and Cheryl, both graduate students at HSU, did the survey work, and they went out starting in pretty early spring when the snows were just melting. Frogs were starting to breed, and then sampled through the summer, doing repeated surveys at the known sites. They did capture, mark, recapture using both pit tags and visual implant elastomer for smaller animals. They swabbed the skin of the frogs to test for disease, and collected local habitat information such as water depths, temperatures, vegetation, and then looked for any interspecies interactions, predators, competition, that type of thing. So the results from 2008, so they did most sites 7 surveys, 7 repeated surveys, some less. There were fires in the region this past summer, so they couldn't get into some sites sometimes. And then a couple sites were just visiting when they could, if they had time in the survey. And they pit tagged 210 frogs. So there's at least 210 individual adult frogs. And believe it or not, that doesn't sound like that many, but that's enormous compared to what we expected. We purchased 100 pit tags and thought that would be plenty. And that's based on those single surveys since prior to 1990, where no one was finding more than 20, 30 frogs. And so we just did not expect that many. So that was great news. The other great news was that the number of egg masses. Carter Meadow 28, Screwdriver Creek Ponds 35. Those are pretty healthy reproducing numbers, and given that one egg mass can have 300 to 500 eggs in it, there's a lot of potential there. And then the visual implant elasmoid frogs include the brand new metamorphs. So we have more of them, the animals coming out. So we had at least about 600 frogs that we marked as individuals. So to summarize the populations, we have 7 remaining populations. The previous slide, there's 2 sites that are really one site. We know they're connected, so there are 7 known populations that are at least somewhat isolated. 5 of them have more than 20 frogs, 2 less than 20. Cascades frogs might be extirpated from Lassen National Park. We've gone back to the one site that had frogs in 2006. We went in 2007, 2008, and so did Gary Fellers, and none of us have found any frogs.
Is that Juniper Lake?
Yeah.
But that only had the single survey in 08?
We did a single survey, Gary Fellers did a single survey. Yeah. So that's the maybe. We haven't spent a lot of time there. And one thing that we did notice by sampling across the season was that we're really not finding the numbers of larvae and metamorphs that we would expect given the number of egg masses. So 28 egg masses, that's a lot of potential larvae. And we're just seeing Carter Meadow, 28 egg masses, 15 larvae, and then 2 metamorphs later in the season. In Klamath, if I see 28 egg masses go back to a site, I'll see thousands of caterpillars.
What's the average size of an egg mass?
The average of it, in terms of numbers,
Number of eggs?
about probably 350.
350?
Yeah. So, and what this looks like, so these yellow triangles are egg masses at Carter Meadow, and the crew went back after the egg masses hatched, and they never found larvae at any of these sites except one. So we think that it either desiccated or predated upon, something happened to the egg masses that they weren't producing the larvae. So we don't have population models surviving and numbers yet. Hopefully with one more season we'll be able to get at that. But we did do some size histograms just to see if we're getting all the size classes in these sites. And when we combine all the sites, it looks pretty good. We have a range of sizes. We go to really large frogs, really small frogs. If we look at individual sites, Colby Creek is one of the sites with very few animals, and we're just not seeing any of the young frogs. It doesn't appear that they're having any successful breeding. Screwdriver Creek is made up of, it's one of the sites that has 2 sites that are interconnected, a pond and a creek downstream. And this is the pond where they reproduce, and so we do see metamorphs coming out, but we're missing that subadult stage. And really, you go to that site and it's adults and larvae and metamorphs, and you're not seeing that subadult stage. So, and then looking at habitat associations of the animals in these sites, and this is broken up by age class of the animals. Black being adults, and then all the versions of gray being the rest. And basically what we see, what just about everybody who researches amphibians sees, is that the different life stages use different habitat types. And the youngest size classes really are focused on those lentic waters, and then the subadults can move into flowing waters as well. The Main Street channel. So you can look at it with flow. Basically, larvae and metamorphs want no flow. Still water, whereas the adults and subadults can move into these stream habitats. Again, that translates into onshore vegetation. The young animals are very focused in on these meadow, open, still water habitats, whereas the adults can be in more complex habitat types. The percent canopy cover, all these frogs are baskers, so they really like the open canopies. But the adults can also occur into areas with higher canopy cover. This is now water temperature, and down here is water depth. So first, water temperature. The larvae are really focusing in, queuing into warm water. They need that warm water to be able to grow and metamorphose in time. So I broke this graph by the sites that are basically, in general, meadow sites, and then we have a couple sites that are pond-based sites. And I broke it out by that because we wanted to see, okay, so the meadows, we're not seeing so much recruitment. Is there any differences between these sites? And the one that really stands out is the water depth for these larvae. In the meadow, our average is about 12 centimeters deep, and whereas at the pond it's 60, 65. And I think that deep water is really important for those larvae. They're sitting in this really shallow water in these meadows and can be easily picked off by predators. So habitat summary. The larvae are really focused in on still, warm, deeper water with open canopies. Subadults can occur in small channels, and are more variable than the larvae metamorphs, but in between. And then adults can occur in deep water, variable flow, and onshore vegetation. And so this type of habitat you can find adults in. It's much easier to get away from predators. They're less susceptible. So we have this habitat information, we have some population information, and what we really are seeing is what's going on with the recruitment. Why aren't we getting more animals turning into adults? And some of our main reasons include disease. We tested all the sites, and they're all positive for amphibian chytrid, which is an extremely deadly disease to amphibians. These frogs are yellow-legged frogs, not red-legged frogs, and a lot of the animals we were finding had these very red legs under here, sign of stress, and it might be related to chytrid. You can even see their lips also appear really pink, and so some of them just did not look healthy, and a lot of the metamorphs the same way. And we marked a lot of animals. We'll see if they're survival into the next year. The most susceptible size or age classes, those subadults, the young, are most susceptible to the disease. And then the loss of breeding habitat in these meadow sites. It appears that they're having a real hard time getting these egg masses to metamorphose, to turn into larvae. And some possible reasons include forced encroachment. We've seen photos from the 40s and then in the 90s, and it really looks like lodgepole are encroaching into these meadows, and they create shading, they alter hydrology. Potentially the hydro period has shortened, and then there really are no pond habitat. In addition, we have noticed predators, including predatory leeches, and we're still testing this hypothesis, but this past year we did see leeches on egg masses, and I can show you a short clip of that. And then pesticides is definitely an issue, potential pesticide drift into these meadows. Gary Fellers is spearheading research on that. So this is what Carter Meadow looks like. This is where animals were found, so you can see it all over. But larvae and metamorphs were only found in that one little area. And so we want to work with the forest to see about actual on-the-ground creation of breeding ponds that we're modifying existing breeding ponds to encourage recruitment. Here's Colby. You can see it's just completely surrounded by pretty dense forest, and we don't see any breeding here at this time, but we do still have some frogs. Let's see. So, right here, see this little thing? Watch that. And this is an egg mass, and Cheryl Bondi took this video of the leech probing this egg mass for, it looks like it's really trying to get at these eggs. And when we've seen 3-4 leeches at a time doing this and eggs getting tossed, and you could imagine that if there's another leech right here going at it. Got a lot of leeches in when these eggs are about to hatch out. You could see that they could potentially have an effect.
These are presumably native leeches?
John Stead, who worked here, he and I have been looking at it, and unfortunately, there really isn't much known about predatory leeches. What is known is that they can be fairly wide-ranging. Some of these species probably were native to this area, but a lot of them are probably introduced. That they were used as bait and moved around a lot. And anecdotal information, John did some interviews with some old-timers, and some guys were saying, I never saw a leech in the 60s. I started seeing them, and then they were everywhere. So we don't know for certain, but chances are they're more common now. So in terms of management recommendations for the forest, our first was create breeding habitat at some of these meadow sites. Down in the southern end of the range, there's pretty much 2 populations left. Carter Creek Meadow, which is doing pretty well, and then Colby, which is not doing well at all, less than 20 animals, no breeding in the past 2 years anyway. And so we're working with the forest. I'm actually going out there next week and to try to lay down some areas where we can at least increase the water depth and hydro period in some of these areas. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there's a lot of endangered plants in the area, and so we have to work with a botanist to figure out how to do it. But the Lassen National Forest is on board, and they want to get things going this year. Further research on amphibian chytrid BD. We have a large-scale study going on right now. It started last summer in both the Klamath and the Lassen area, so we're really trying to figure out what is going on with BD, and we're going to be getting another PhD student involved in that. So hopefully we'll be able to get a clue as to what's going on, basically in terms of survival and in terms of habitat differences. Some of these sites, the water temperature can reach 30 degrees centigrade, and that, so far with lab experiments, that has shown to be deadly to BD. So if the animals are metamorphosing at that time, maybe they're able to get rid of the disease, but who knows. And then we're thinking of working with the forest to do an experiment with potentially forest thinning and or controlled burning to see how that affects hydrology and the response of Cascades frogs. These sites these meadow sites are really complex, they have a lot of springs, and so we're thinking if we could use springs as replicates and the sort of spring watershed, microshed. But that's in infant stages. And then pesticide effect studies, Gary Fellers is working on that. And that's it.
Where's the pesticide coming from?
Central Valley. In some of the earlier work on the pesticides, what they were finding in terms of drift was that the coast control and Lassen were similar. And now they're thinking that amphibians are so sensitive to pesticides, and there is some stuff that is coming in that area.
Those are upper elevation spring pit meadows. How's the pesticide getting into the system? The Forest Service isn't spraying up there a lot.
On the wind, in the air.